If Psalm 105, which we looked at last week, focuses on God's faithfulness, then Psalm 106 strikes a very different note as it focuses on God's people's sinfulness. If the take-home from Psalm 105 was that we should remember God and his saving acts, then Psalm 106 is a depressing catalogue of how God's people failed to remember and instead forgot. As the psalmist looks back over Israel's sorry spiritual history, he knows that he's no different to those who have come before him. Verse 6, we have sinned, even as our ancestors did. And of course, what was true for him is true for us. We have sinned, even as our ancestors did. Most of this psalm is taken up with a whistle-stop tour of the sins of our ancestors. And each time we see Israel sin, we're also shown the challenging circumstances they were facing. And yet those challenging circumstances are never an excuse for their sin. They're not let off the hook for forgetting God and his saving acts. We've only got time to pause at 3 of the stops along the way, and the first place we're going to go is verse 7, where we're transported to the edge of the Red Sea, back to the moment when Moses has just led the Israelites out of Egypt. And here they're trapped between the waters in front of them and the advancing Egyptian army behind them. No doubt it was a challenging place to be as they feared losing that freedom they just won and returning to slavery. And yet the psalmist makes no excuses for the Israelites not remembering the Lord's many kindnesses to them. He's clear their failure to remember is a sin. And for us, it may be that in this challenging season, when our freedom is curtailed, that you've lost sight of the Lord's many kindnesses to you. You've stumbled into that same sin as the Israelites. You've forgotten when you should be remembering. Well, the next place on our tour is a bit later in the psalm, verses 24 and 25. And here we find Israel a bit further on in their history, on the edge of the promised land. And the spies who went ahead of them have just reported back that the inhabitants of the land are strong and powerful, that they're a fearful enemy. And facing a fearful enemy, it's definitely a challenging situation. But again, the psalmist, he doesn't excuse Israel's forgetfulness. He's clear they're guilty for not believing God's promise to give them the land. And it may be the fears of our time have made you doubt, made you forget God's promise that death has been defeated. It may be the sin of unbelief is creeping into your life. Well, our last stop on our tour comes in verses 34 to 39. Israel, they've entered the land and they're facing the challenges of a new way of life. And to be honest, they've not dealt with the change very well because they've forgotten their God. They've forgotten that his ways are best. And they've forgotten his warnings about the power of idols. And so, verse 37, they worshipped their idols, which became a snare to them. Again, the psalmist makes no excuses for their sinful failure to remember. And it may be the challenging circumstances of our time, where the pattern of our lives have been changed. They mean we're spending more time on our own at home, less time with our Christian friends and church family. It may be that these challenging circumstances are threatening your godliness. It may be the ways of the world look more and more attractive to you. It may be you're in danger of forgetting that God's ways are best, that you're about to be ensnared. As the psalmist said, we have sinned, even as our ancestors did. And yet, despite confronting us with our forebearers' sin, that sin which we ourselves are not immune from, Psalm 106 is ultimately a psalm of good news. I wonder if you noticed how it's topped and tailed with praises to the Lord, how its opening note is one of thankfulness. And you may be thinking, well, how can that be? How can the psalmist, who knows he sins by forgetting God just as easily as those earlier generations, how can he draw near to God in praise like this? Well, here's the answer. It's because God is not like us. God does not forget. We can count on him to remember. Look with me at the prayer of verses 4 and 5. The psalmist says, "Remember me, Lord, when you show favour to your people. Come to my aid when you save them, that I may enjoy the prosperity of your chosen ones, that I may share in the joy of your nation and join your inheritance in giving praise." You see, our God is a God who remembers, a God who shows favour, a God who comes to our aid and saves us from ourselves. No wonder the psalmist wants to praise the Lord. And so why not take a moment? Take a moment to confess the ways in which you've forgotten God's goodness. Take a moment to thank him that he remembered you, that he showed you favour by sending Jesus to die for you. And why not praise the Lord for his love that endures forever?